She had a small baby on her knee, grabbed a hammer in her left hand. Ain't no one as strong as me. This is hammer, kill John Henry. Won't kill me, won't kill me. This is hammer, killed your daddy. Throw it down and we'll be free.
Shiva, Shiva, you feel now, you feel now. How does your spirit fly? Blood in your blood, bone in your bone, by the grace of your strength, we have life. From the golden coast of Ghana to the bondage of Grenada, you kept the dream of hope alive. They burned your body, they cursed your blackness, but they could not take your lights. Kashiva, Kashiva, you're free now, you're free now. How does your spirit fly? Blood in your blood, bone in your bone, by the grace of your strength, we have life. Raped and beaten, your baby's taken. Starved and sold again. Ain't you man of love deserving? Any something you survive. Kashiva, Kashiva, you're free now, you're free now. How does your spirit fly? Blood in your blood, bone in your bone, by the grace of your strength, we have life. You dreamt of home, you dreamt of freedom. You died a slave, you died alone. You came from warriors who once built empires. Ashanti's kingdom carries on. Kashiva, Kashiva, you're free now, you're free now. How does your spirit fly? Blood in your blood, bone in your bone, by the grace of your strength, we have life. You were forgotten, almost forsaken. Your children founded generations. Your strength sustained them. They won their freedom. Trace their roots to find your way there. Kashiva, Kashiva, you're free now, you're free now. How far your spirits flow. Blood in your blood, bone in your bone, by the grace of your strength, we are home. Blood in your blood, bone in your bone, by the grace of your strength, we are home. By the grace of your strength, we are home. We are home. We are home. We are home.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dale Cavaney, and on behalf of the Blue Ridge Conservancy Board of Trustees and staff, I welcome you to our presentation of Black and Blue, African Americans in the Blue Ridge Parkway. The Blue Ridge Conservancy is committed to helping create an outdoors experience where all people feel safe and welcome, and this webinar is a step toward that goal. We plan to have a time at the end to answer a few questions, so feel free to submit questions to the panelists in the Q&A. It will also help us as we move forward in this work if we know a little more about you. So if you wouldn't mind in the Q&A, if you would drop in your location, and if you're with an organization or an agency, if you could put that in also, that'd be very helpful. There's already a question in the Q&A about the songs, and those are from songs from our native daughters. And it's a wonderful soundtrack, and I encourage you to look that up. Joining us tonight are three talented presenters, guides, and pathfinders. Rebecca Branson Jones is a musician and filmmaker from North Carolina. She is a graduate of the MA Appalachian Studies program at Appalachian State University. Jones worked as an apprentice editor for the Ken Burns documentary Country Music in 2019 and is currently working on a documentary series about mental health due to air on PBS in 2022. Dr. Carmen Foster couples her lens as a public historian with expertise in organizational leadership, team development, and facilitation as a consultant and coach for senior executives and next generation leaders. She earned her doctorate in education from the University of Virginia and holds a master's in public administration from Harvard University. As a child of the civil rights movement, she was one of the first wave of students to desegregate the Richmond, Virginia school system. Ajena Cason Rogers is the supervisory park ranger at Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site, where she helps visitors connect to the inspiring story of Maggie Lena Walker, businesswoman, community activist, and nationally known African-American leader during the Jim Crow era of segregation. Ajena began her National Park Service career as a seasonal interpreter on the Blue Ridge Parkway in 1984, and often feels that she grew up in the Park Service. Having worked in several parks, she has found herself drawn to social history ripe for the telling, particularly stories about the African-American experience. Rebecca, would you start us off with a brief history of the Blue Ridge Parkway?
Sure thing. Thank you, Dale. I will share my screen now. Does that look okay to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great. In 2009, I was a graduate student at Appalachian State University, and I was hired by the Blue Ridge Parkway to research and write a historical resource study focusing on African Americans and the Parkway. Today, I would write this report very differently, and since 2009, I've learned a lot about white supremacy and systemic racism and my part in it as a white person. I see now that my report fails to acknowledge the role white supremacy plays in the creation of the Parkway and its effects on Black visitors. My report is incomplete without these voices and perspectives of African American people. I'm grateful to our panelists, Dr. Carmen Foster and Park Ranger Ajena Rogers, for being with us today to help us begin a more inclusive conversation. Here are a few quick facts about the Parkway in case you are unfamiliar. The Parkway is 469 miles long. It runs on the top of Virginia and North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains. The Parkway is classified as a tourist road for passenger cars only and not for commercial use. It is a part of the U.S. government's national park system, and construction began in 1935 and was completed in sections over time until 1987. 15 million people visit the Parkway every year. I'd like to, there we go. I'd like to take a moment now to provide some context about white supremacy and systemic racism before we jump into the facts of the report. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging colonization is at the root of racism. National parks were created by violently displacing and breaking treaties with indigenous people. The Blue Ridge Parkway sits on the unceded lands of the Cherokee, Monacan, and Catawba people. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And I invite all of us to build relationships and take action by finding Native groups in our communities, learning about their work, and seeing how we can support them. So it's always important to understand who holds the power, who's making the decisions, and who is writing the story. And in the Parkway's case, here are a few of the main figures that were involved in the planning, starting in the mid-1930s. The Parkway was first suggested by President Roosevelt, suggested to President Roosevelt in 1933 by Virginia Senator Harry Byrd. He had the idea to connect the Skyline Drive in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina. Harry Byrd was a segregationist and white separatist. Arno Kammerer was the National Park Service director at the time. Josephus Daniels from North Carolina had the ear of the president as the ambassador to Mexico, and Daniels advocated for the Parkway to take route through Asheville instead of Tennessee. Daniels was a white supremacist and segregationist and was one of the leaders of the Wilmington Massacre in 1898, in which 2,000 white supremacists overthrew the local biracial government in Wilmington, North Carolina, resulting in the murder of hundreds of Black people and destruction of Black businesses. Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior and approved the Parkway in 1933. His views on race relations were a bit more progressive as he was involved with the NAACP in Chicago. Stanley Abbott, a New York landscape architect, was hired to oversee the Parkway project. Robert Lee Doughton was a member of the House of Representatives from Laurel Springs, North Carolina, and he is said to be responsible for making a deal with President Roosevelt to ensure the Parkway would be routed through Asheville. Doughton was named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and his father was a Confederate captain. Doughton is also known for introducing the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which outlawed marijuana, and this law is rooted in racist propaganda. As we can see by the photos, all these men are white and privileged in their political influence. One of the few African Americans among these politicians was William J. Trent Jr. He was from Atlanta, and he was the advisor on African American affairs to the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. Trent advocated for desegregating the national parks, and with the support of Ickes, the parks were desegregated in 1945. When talking about African Americans and their use of the Parkway, we have to talk about the risks of driving while Black. The myth of the open road was made for white people. White folks have the luxury of vacationing in faraway places for leisure without restrictions, traveling freely and safely with access to resources they need when driving across the country. The Parkway was designed with white tourists in mind who live off the mountain, who have a car, paid time off, and extra income to spend on accommodations, food, and gas. Mobility is essential to freedom, as Gretchen Soren says, author and professor. And mobility has never been the right for everyone in the United States. So much of American law is focused upon policing Black people and their movement in this country for the last 400 years, starting with the slave patrols. Fast forward to the Jim Crow era in the South, Black travelers in the United States had no reliably safe access to services and accommodations while they were on the road because of racist segregation laws and white supremacist vigilantes. Data shows between 1916 and 1970, 6 million Southern Black folks moved from the South to the North and West, seeking a safer place to live, fleeing segregation, terrorism, lynchings, and economic inequality. For African American families, long road trips may have been reserved for traveling back home to the South to reconnect with their family and friends who decided to stay. Traveling has always been a safety risk for African Americans in this country. Throughout the retelling of U.S. history, much of Black history has been erased. The Parkway is no exception. All along the Parkway are restored log cabins and story signs designed to present pioneer life that was portrayed as white only, resulting in teaching visitors the myth of an all-white Appalachia, which has never been true and is not true today. This is an extension of white supremacy that erases Black history. So, getting on to my study, there were three main subjects that I focused on: segregation on the Parkway, the Civilian Conservation Corps camp at Galax, Virginia, and African American communities. Before the Parkway was built, the Skyline Drive was already in existence in the Shenandoah National Park. And in the Shenandoah National Park, there was a segregated campground for African American use only, called Lewis Mountain Campground. And I don't go into that here just because that campground was on the Skyline Drive and not the Blue Ridge Parkway. The Parkway was open to visitors starting in 1937 during the Jim Crow era in the South. The Parkway targeted plans for segregated areas to correspond with large African American populations, which were found around Lynchburg and Roanoke, Virginia. According to the 1940 census, Lynchburg and Roanoke reported 22,000 African Americans living in the two urban centers. It was reported in 1942 that less than 0.5% of Parkway visitors were African American. This statistic could be interpreted in many ways. African Americans may not have felt safe driving to or driving on the Parkway. Black folks may not have had the opportunity to have a job that allowed vacation days or to afford a car. This statistic would also influence the white Parkway planners to discard plans for segregated areas because they thought there was not a significant need to make those spaces available. There were several segregated recreation areas proposed on the Parkway, but there were only 2 implemented. As we can see, most of the plans for segregated areas were in Virginia. And the first recreation area to open was at Cumberland Knob in 1937. And this area is located on the border of North Carolina and Virginia. By 1940, a North Carolina Recreation Survey listed 5 campsites designated for African American use. There were no signs posted to designate this segregated area, but the park ranger on duty was to direct Black visitors to the area. As you can see, this segregated area is well out of sight from the white campground, which makes clear that the architects were trying to hide African American visitors. The second segregated park to be implemented is at Dalton Park, which is named after House of Representative Robert Lee Dalton. This site was implemented in the early 1940s, and as you can see, the woods picnic area for African Americans is more hidden by trees and is below a parking lot, whereas the meadows picnic area for white folks is more open with a view of picturesque mountain ranges. Here is a photo of the bathroom building at the segregated picnic area in 1976. The building was built in 1942. And moving to the next slide, you can see this is what it looks like in 2009, abandoned long before 2009 or 1976. And this area was abandoned roughly around the late 1960s. As you can see in 2009, the picnic tables are deteriorating as well. The greatest effort to accommodate African American use on the parkway was with the recreation area of Pine Spur, 27 miles south of Roanoke, Virginia. The recreation area was planned for African American use only and was to have a coffee shop, camping grounds, a cabin area, playgrounds, and a softball field. Here is a master plan from 1940. As you can see, picnic area here, and playgrounds, softball fields, and places for campers and tent camping. We've got a coffee shop and cabin area here. Construction began in 1941 with the completion of an entrance road and a parking area with swings and picnic tables pictured here. In 1942, World War II stopped construction of the entire parkway. This could have been a major constraint on finishing Pine Spur combined with limited resources. By the end of the war in 1945, the national parks had been desegregated with the help of William Trent, and Pine Spur was never completed or opened. The parkway was built by private contractors who did not keep personnel records, so it's difficult to find out who specifically worked on the parkway. But we can see through photos at the Blue Ridge Parkway archives that there certainly were African Americans involved in the labor of building the parkway and in park ranger positions. In 1973, we have Willie McDaniel, and in 1985, that is our own panelist, Ajena Rogers. And in 1942, we see a paver and a road crew in 1973. And much more research to be done combing through these photographs in the archives for more photos of African American workers. There was an African American CCC camp on the parkway, and there were 4 camps located on the parkway for landscape purposes. So one of those was Camp NP-29 in Galax, Virginia, often called or referred to as Piper's Gap or Baywood. The exact location of this particular camp is uncertain, as it has been listed as many different names and mentioned in a locally published book written about the Baywood area, which is where this photo is from. The photos of the buildings here could have been the buildings from Camp NP-29. We do know that the camp opened in 1940 in December, and there were 180 African American enrollees ranging from 18 to 25 years old. The camp closed in 1942 and the buildings were demolished in 1944. So there may not be any evidence of this camp today, but surely there are people that remember it and descendants of those African Americans who were enrollees. The last focus in my report is about African American communities. An important aid in that research was the Blue Ridge Folklife Study done in 1978 by Dr. Patrick Mullen, which focused on in a 10-mile radius of the parkway at the North Carolina and Virginia state line. Mullen photographed these communities and recorded oral histories with several African American folks from Sparta, North Carolina, and Galax, Virginia. As we can see, Mamie and Leonard Bryan of Sparta holding their wedding photo from 1914, and the Redmond Creek Church from Galax, and Dean Gamble from Sparta, who actually worked on the parkway. These interviews have been digitized and now available to listen to at the Library of Congress website. And here are a few more photos from Dr. Mullen's collection. Lizzie Price was a homesteader who moved to Pine Spur in Virginia to start farming and raising her family with her husband well before the parkway was built. Lizzie Price was born enslaved in 1845 below the mountain. She sold her property to the government in the late 1940s because the government required her land to build the parkway. Here she is pictured at 106 with her son and her son's wife, and she lived to be 108. Another example of African American homesteaders on the Parkway is the Saunders Farm. George and Bertie Saunders settled near Peaks of Otter in 1905. They raised 9 children on their land, which included a homestead, meat house, chicken house, and corn house. They sold their land to the government for the Parkway to be built on in 1942 for $2,000. In 2005, there was a historic report done about the Saunders Farm. As you can see, a picture here from 2005 compared with 1977. There is no public access to the Saunders Farm, and there is no interpretive sign on the Parkway for visitors to learn about the African American homesteaders' experience. Nearby this farm, just down the road on the Parkway, is the Johnson family farm, a white-owned homestead from the 1850s that was restored by the National Park Service in 1974. Interpreters are on site there at the Johnson farm, and it's accessible and open to the public. This is an example of the erasure of Black history on the Parkway. More evidence of African American life and history on the Parkway can be seen in the cemeteries along the road. In the Meadows of Dan, Virginia, there is a Black cemetery near the Meadows of Dan Baptist Church. When the Parkway bought the land, the grave markers were mown over and lost. The number of burials is estimated between 8 and 10 enslaved people. In 2018, the Park Service placed a monument at the gravesite in memorial to those buried there. Another cemetery is the Pinespur Gap Graveyard, which is near the proposed Pinespur Recreation Area and home of Lizzie Price. Burials at this cemetery continued until the 1880s. There is no public access to the graveyard from the Parkway today. As you can see, it is quite close. There's much more research to be done on this topic, and just a few suggestions would be to find more information about experiences of Black Parkway Rangers. Were there any Parkway locations listed in the tourist books that African Americans used to find safe places, such as the Green Book? There's more research to be done on the CCC camp and trying to find oral histories with relatives from the enrollees, and gathering oral histories in African American communities at present on the Parkway. The Saunders Farm needs to be restored, acknowledged, and interpreted for visitors to learn about the African American homesteading experience on the Parkway. And new research by Ann Wisnett brought to my attention that there is a Confederate memorial on the Parkway near Waynesville, North Carolina, and the Park Service needs to reckon with this fact and acknowledge the harm it causes for Black visitors. If you're interested in learning more about Parkway history, I would suggest checking out books by Ann Wisnett and Harley Jolly. And for more information and stories and history about the African American experience in Appalachia, check out the Black in Appalachia project as well as podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about systemic racism, I recommend Driving While Black by Gretchen Soren. So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Oluwo, and My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Minikin. This concludes my part of the program. I'd like to take a moment to let all of that information land, and I will unshare my screen. And you can take this time to submit a question to the Q&A. We will answer those questions in the last 10 minutes of our program. I'm excited to hear from our panelists now as we continue this conversation with Dr. Foster and Ranger Ajena. Thanks so much for being here and sharing your experience with us.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. I'm always amazed at the rich history that is there with the Blue Ridge Parkway that you unveiled. And I really appreciate the fact that now that it's been like about 12 years since you did the research, you know, how your lens is expanding on what else there is to find. I think that that's one thing about history is that it's not static, it's always evolving. And when we started this, one of the things that was fascinating for me was to ask myself, what are my memories? You know, I don't like to consider myself an elder, but, you know, as I asked myself, what do I remember about the Blue Ridge Parkway? And some key things that you said were really important. One was that traveling was a real safety risk. And I remember that also as a child, my parents tried to do their best to shield us from the indignities of segregation, from the indignities of racism as much as they could. Because parents, all parents, want to make sure that their children feel that they're in a safe and secure environment. So some things that I could remember as we would travel is often we would go to Charlottesville to visit one of my father's friends who happened to be a dentist and went to dental school with him at Howard University. And after we went to Charlottesville, we would take the Blue Ridge Parkway to go from the north entrance of the parkway down to Lynchburg. So sometimes we would do the Skyline Drive area of that just to have the experience of seeing the vistas. But clearly we were there in the light of day. And while I thought it was great, I never understood, but now I recognize how important that was because we would even pack box lunches. And of course, everybody you think packs box lunches. But there was something always different because our parents would shield us from the fact that there might not be restaurants along the way that we could go into because everything was segregated. And the other concern that they had was, my God, these children are always going to go to the bathroom. What children don't, right? So it's a matter of making sure that you're prepared for every emergency that needs to be handled outdoors, because they also didn't want us to suffer any indignities that we would have to contend with. Because again, parents care about safety, they care about security and cleanliness, and they want to make sure that we got safe into Lynchburg, or if we would even drive through the parkway to Roanoke in a way that would be clearly before dark. So that I think really is interesting. I also, as a historian, said, well, let me do some preliminary work to see what kinds of oral history tidbits I might have from retired teachers that I know. And for instance, when I talked to one in her 90s, she said, nope. And I live in Richmond, Virginia. They said the drive was too long. And she also said, well, there was no history relating to African Americans. So why would I go there? So I thought that was interesting for her to say. Another elderly retired teacher told me that maybe they would go to Luray once in a while, but it was a long school trip. And so maybe you wouldn't see that in Richmond, but I need to tell you that even though I'm a city girl, I'm married into a Southwest Virginia family. And interesting, so has my son. And my mother-in-law would tell me about how they would take the children sometimes for Luray Caverns. But I know that they had the same kinds of anxiousness and also preparations for those children when they would drive through that area to make sure that they were always safe. Those are some things that I can remember in terms of my own travel. I also talked to another educator who's almost 90, who's in North Carolina, to ask him the question. And then it gave me more insight into your data point about, you know, the fact that 1% or less would even be around in the Parkway area from the data that they kept in the 1940s. You know, one thing he said was during that era of segregation, people stayed in people's homes. So it wasn't as if you could just easily stay in and camp out or go someplace. You needed to be in a place that was safe. And he even recalled how his father, who was a minister, was always busy with having people staying at their homes. And there was a lot of racism he talked about me with, about just going to the mountains, a lot of anxiety about people's security. So that with Asheville being the closest city to where they were in Durham, you know, people really didn't have much leisure time back when he was growing up. Another point that he did mention that I really think it is important, Rebecca, that you've already honored is, where is the story of the indigenous people? Because clearly, as a native North Carolinian, he recognizes how important that is, and how are those stories left out in the larger conversation about the land and the Blue Ridge Parkway. So those are some of the things that I recall. And as I'm trying to get data to find out what people remember, it really connects with the data point that you had. You know, in preparing for this, I went to my favorite national park ranger in Richmond, Virginia, who happens to be a good friend, Ajena Rogers. And was I surprised when Ajena said, wait a minute, I'm from Roanoke, I'm a Black Appalachian, and I get it. So I was so glad when she decided to join us. So, Ajena, I'm so interested in what you have to say with this, because this blue is in your blood.
It most certainly is. I am a Black Appalachian from the Blue Ridge. No matter how much I change my accent when I have to, it always comes through and through. And I grew up, as you said, in Roanoke, Virginia. I came along at the time when the school system was just beginning to integrate. So my kindergarten class, my first grade class, were the first to go through all 12 years of schooling in a fully integrated system. But to me, that put me in an odd position, in that I didn't quite fit in with the African-American students, because I would ride the bus to the schools. The goal was to integrate the schools. So I left a lot of the neighborhood. And then I wasn't quite fitting in with the white students, because I wasn't living in their neighborhood. So I always felt like I just was that data point in the Venn diagram, that the only fitting in right there. So I've spent a lot of time trying to find my roots and find myself. But one thing I was always comfortable with was that when I went out in my backyard, I could look and I'd see Mill Mountain, and I'd see the Blue Ridge Mountains up there. And when I went to church in Cave Spring, the people that our family church was founded by were from Cave Spring, from the Roanoke area. The mountains were comforting for us. So after church, oftentimes, a very inexpensive way to enjoy a Sunday afternoon would be to leave and go up onto the mountain, go to Mill Mountain, which is just below the Blue Ridge and connects with Roanoke Mountain, and would watch the hang gliders go down. We'd hike through the trails, or we'd go up north of the Roanoke Mountain and go down off the way to the Roanoke River and walk along in there, just be surrounded by all the trees and so on. You see, we were there. But I will tell you this, that I never saw a park ranger until I went for the job interview in 1984. So when Rebecca, you're talking about that point, less than 1%, I think they just didn't see us because we didn't see them to be counted. And then the one time before that My father was waiting in the parking area as my mom and my brothers and sister and I went hiking. I think that was the first time I'd ever heard of a park ranger. He was just resting in the car and somebody knocked on the window and checked to see if he was all right. And he told us about this, but he didn't have a name, you know, or anything like that. It was after I started working for the Park Service that I realized that it was a park ranger that was patrolling the area and checking on my dad as he was parked in the parking lot. Was that for his protection, or was that to see if he was in the right place? Knowing my colleagues, as I came to do, is to see if he was in the right place. But what do you think might have been going through my dad's mind as he was being approached by a law enforcement officer as he's relaxing in his car? You know, so those are my experiences with that. But when the way I got to work for the Park Service is that somebody reached out to one of my high school teachers and said, hey, you know, we're looking to employ people, new high school, college students on the Parkway. We need park rangers. And so she called me up and I said, sure, I'd love to work on the Parkway. Where's the Parkway? I didn't even connect that the places that we have been going for all of my life was part of a larger system. When I got there, though, I found people, my colleagues were very welcoming. One of my supervisory rangers was Art Frederick. He went on to become one of the associate regional directors. He's African-American from Florida and came to work on the Parkway. So he's somebody that you can interview and look in to find out more about his experiences in the late 80s, early 90s. There was Leon, who was a maintenance worker. But the person that had the most effect on me was Mosey Welch Reed. Now, she was not African-American, but she was an Appalachian woman. And she was brave to dig deep into her roots to find out and do a program called Mountain Woman. And I loved that program. I was always there in her audience. If she had gotten sick one night at the campground, I could have just put on the outfit and done it myself. But then she turned to me and said, you know, Gina, you can be a granny woman. You can portray a woman of the mountains. And I said, you know, I put my hands on my hip and said, I'm not big and round and fat and black. I can't be a granny woman. And then she looked at me straight in the eye and said, is your grandmother big and round and fat and black? I had to step back. I had bought into the stereotypes in spite of all that was in front of me, all the people who were around me who were exactly not what TV had been feeding into us about what the hillbilly was like and what a Black person was like and what a woman was like. I had bought into that as a young person. So by Mosey opening my eyes there and getting me to see the story that I had to share within me, I started interviewing. I'd always talked to my grandmother who grew up in South Carolina and lived right around the corner from us. And she was always telling stories. So I learned her storytelling technique. And then I started learning from the other people in the church that I went to in Cave Spring, Bethlehem, Cave Spring, that community that was right along the Blue Ridge Parkway. And then I had the Rebecca, you mentioned the Blue Ridge Folklife Project. I ate that up because we had, I'm sorry, I'm clapping back, I'm getting excited. We had that research fresh on cassette tapes. And I, would imbibe that. And out of all of that, I created a program called Granny Foster Remembers. Now, she's not related to the Fosters of Richmond. She's a composite character.
I'll claim her. I'll claim
You
her.
can claim her because she can remind me of you. But with that, I created this composite character called Granny Foster Remembers. And I started doing this program and realized that people wanted to know. They wanted to hear my story. They wanted to hear and learn. And so with that, I got the confidence to speak about my own past, my own present, and open my own eyes to the rich heritage of the people who were part of the Black community. And yes, I remember Pine Spur was in our district. And so I'd run down from Benton and go down to Pine Spur. But by that point, it was only the drive-throughs, the cut-ins that you would have put the campground. We didn't hear anything about the cemetery, I don't think. But it was so far away from the main that, we'd only go down there every once in a while. And I know I never heard about the Saunders farm while I was there, but we knew the Johnson farm at the Peaks of Otter. But learning and creating the story, Granny Foster Remembered, allowed me to share what I did know, what I did learn. And with that, I was, along with Mosey, we were able to take it on the road. We went down to Asheville. I went down, did a presentation with the Forest Service, and did that for about 9 years, that program. And with that, I grew so much that I learned how to speak, how to come out of myself, out of my shell. First doing living history, but now I'm just as comfortable in my green and gray. If you talk to me, oh gosh, just 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm doing today. But the value of someone, my high school teacher and her friend reaching out, Mosey reaching and pulling me along, Art Frederick being such an example to me of where we could go and what we could do. And then working at Booker T. Washington Monument, Booker T. Washington, another Black Appalachian who was very successful with founding Tuskegee Institute and speaking and leading in his period of time, the same time with Maggie Walker. I learned all these examples and the rich history of African-American involvement in the national park system, more than I can talk about right here. But there's a pride that comes from knowing that you belong, that no matter what someone, a larger system tries to study, the white supremacy that is laid on top, we are always resilient. We always found a way. Rebecca, when you did the thing about the trees for the woods and then the meadow with all the vistas, I'm going, I'd rather have the trees because it's hot. It's hot up there. You can have a lot of good time with the good shade and everything. When you're driving, you can see the vistas. So what was meant for ill can often be turned for good. You learn your resilience when you do that. So yes, getting my start as a Black woman on the Blue Ridge was something I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. And to hear the accents of the people who are talking right now and listening to that music, it just brings me back home and makes me appreciate my path. So the last thing I want to share is the way I used to close out my program, Granny Foster Remembers. It's the program I did in honor of my grandmother, Fanny Conyers Cason. You can see her picture right behind me. I still keep her and my grandfather close by. And it's for the women like my grandmother, the women like Aunt Eula, Aunt Eleanor, and Rita Bradley. Rita Bradley was one of the people who was interviewed for some of these projects trying to get the stories of Black Appalachians. And I took to heart her poem, which is called I Am What I Am. And it goes like this. You call me black when my skin is tan, my daughter is golden, and my son's hair is bronze. I'm supposed to be soul, yet I love country music, cowboy hats, boots, blue jeans, and hoedowns. I'm proud of my African ancestry, but I am sick inside of being denied my Scotch-Irish heritage. I'm 1 part Cherokee Indian, happy about it, and look it. I feel secure in the mountains. Nothing is more beautiful than the nearby ranges tipped with clouds. I love mountain crafts, mountain people, and babbling mountain streams. Oh, for my spirits to be allowed to soar free, how I long for full acknowledgement as a true and intricate part of the mountain scene. I am here. I belong here. I am Appalachia's, and Appalachia is mine.
Thank you, Ajena. Thank you so much. I am overwhelmed with both the poetry that you've shared and also the poetry that is in the Blue Ridge Mountains itself. Poetry, stories, this is all universal as well as eternal. And there are real opportunities for us to learn more about each other's stories. I'm curious, as I look at Dale in one of the virtual screens next to me, to say, Dale, what are some questions that people might have?
Yeah, I'm a bit awestruck, Carmen. I feel like I need to just sit with Ajena's poem a bit.
Oh, yeah.
A question that has come up from one of the participants, and maybe I'll modify it just a bit. So, how do our histories of the Parkway, both the told and untold, influence how everyday travelers interact with this space? And we have about 7 minutes, and I'll be curious to hear from the 3 of you. So how does the histories told and untold influence the visitors today?
Well, I would say that the way that those stories told and untold influence the visitors today traveling through is that it helps to guide where they're going to visit. For example, if you're promoting a story that is new or different, that's one that they're not familiar with, such as my story that I had with Granny Foster Remembers, and you put it out there, they may be curious to come to a campground such as Roanoke Mountain or out to Pine Spur. So that's the way that it influences their visitation. But it's hard to know which stories they're going to be interested in as you go along. So, trying to get those stories to broaden it also influences, because if you know that your story, something that you're familiar with or can initially know about, is starting to be told, then you might change the way you look at the place. And you may come out and visit it yourself, and you'll find even more things there that you have that you're interested in. So that's how it can influence, I think.
What about you, Rebecca? You've had, I'm terrible with math, but I think that's about 13 years, 11
12,
years?
yes,
12
12
years.
12 to 13, yes.
Yeah, to reflect. So how do the stories told and untold affect the visitor's experience today?
Well, I grew up going to the Blue Ridge Parkway. My mom loved driving the parkway, and I loved the story of Appalachia, and I was taught the myth of white Appalachia from the parkway by seeing all these log cabins that were inhabited by white pioneers. And so I, you know, researching this topic and studying Appalachian studies and being involved in a community that is intersectional and inclusive has expanded my idea of Appalachia way beyond what I thought when I was a kid. So I think it's important that we start to move the parkway's histories forward into our time now and start to interpret these sites that need their stories told to help visitors learn about the Black experience in Appalachia and on the Parkway. I think it's essential and it's crucial.
You know, I'm excited about in this day and time what we can do on the internet. I mean, we are networked communities in ways where we can begin to explore and share. And when I think about some of the communities that have African American conclaves around the Parkway area broadly, you know, they have internet access. They're interested in their communities and their stories and the legacies that they can leave. Just by surfing on the internet, I found out about a group that's called the valleyblack.heritage.org. And as they connect, and they are near Harrisonburg, they're having activities, festivals, everybody. I don't care if you are green, you like food, right? And so where there are food festivals, where there is music, where there are gatherings where everyone can feel welcome, that's how you can begin to explore these untold and retold stories. So I think one opportunity that we have going forward is, how do we develop this curiosity and see what's around and support what people are doing and connect with each other to build relationships with people that we know and people that we need to know. I think that this is really about relationships as we move forward in this, because everybody learns something about themselves when they hear the story, whether it's from the mountains or whether it's from the city. All stories have power and significance because we are all part of the humanity on Earth.
So we have 2 minutes left. And so this was a question I asked these panelists last week when we did a run through. What does success look like for you on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and maybe expand it to the national park system in general in 1 or 2 sentences? What does success look like?
I would say success looks like getting more people involved and interested in coming up to the Parkway. One phrase of Booker T. Washington was, cast down your buckets where you are. There are many people like me who are living at the foot of the mountain, who go there all the time, that are young folk who need to be a part of it. And that, look at those places. And if you can pull some interns in and students in, that would be successful, a way to reach and expand.
Great. So what does success look like for you, Rebecca?
Success looks like lifting up the stories of of people who have been left out, and acknowledging their contribution.
I'd concur with what my colleagues have said. I think that there are so many opportunities to expand relationships, to get curious about wanting to know what you don't know, and listening, really actively listening and being open to what somebody's experience is. It doesn't have to be yours, but now that you understand their experience, look at what you might think about doing in terms of anything from interns to college students, particularly at HBCUs, as well as the colleges in Virginia and North Carolina, 4-H programs, scouting, churches. You know, I think that's what makes the Blue Ridge a welcoming destination, when we can all collaborate and come together in new ways and be curious, because it's the stories that make the difference, because the mountains are full of stories from the past, the present, and even as we work together, the future.
Well, thank you very much. And I will finish on this note. We at the Blue Ridge Conservancy are very interested in hearing your stories, and you'll be receiving a link that'll have a link for this, the recording of this webinar, but there'll also be an email address there or a link where you can share your stories of what is it about the outdoor experience that you enjoy. Because one of the things that I have come to realize is my outdoor experience may be very different than Rebecca's outdoor experience, and may be very different from Ajena's outdoor experience. So what is it that you love about the outdoors? Dr. Foster, Ranger Ajena, Ranger AJ, I forgot. Rebecca, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much. And thank you, participants, for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.
Good night.